So this is the second part of a lecture on Freud's Totem and Taboo, in which, in this case, we're going to look not so much at the question as we did in the last lecture, at the question of animal metamorphosis, or how the father becomes the totem animal in Freud's reading, and then how the totem animal becomes a sort of a stand-in or a substitute for the father, who is then sacrificed in these rites. Now, in Moses and Monotheism, which was written, as we said in the last lecture, around the same year that Freud died, it's the last thing that he wrote. It's very interesting. We find Freud as a Jewish man driven from his home in Vienna and sent into exile in London, who's now watched this disastrous rise of the Third Reich and what that has not only meant for people everywhere, but also for himself. And really, this is of course before knowledge of the death camps emerged. So we find him really in a kind of, because he died before a lot of the knowledge of the concentration camps and terrible slaughter that took place during the during that time, the Shoah. We find him nonetheless, reflecting, asking, why is there this hostility to the Jewish people? What is the root of this anti-Semitism? Particularly when he reflects upon how monotheism, was we said, is sort of intolerant monotheism as opposed to henotheism, which is akin to a more tolerant monotheism. Was the invention of a Egyptian pharaoh named Akhenaten, but was experienced as a trauma by the ancient world, and he speculates that Moses, who is the most important prophet for Jews, was in his reading an Egyptian. In fact, he etymologically he connects the name Moses to Ramses, and suggests that he was a disgruntled follower of Akhenaten, who, after Akhenaten's death and this new intolerant monotheism was stricken from the records in Egypt, and monotheism and Akhenaten's name was what people wanted to forget that he even existed, that he left because he wanted to cling to this new religion. It's an interesting theory, and Egyptologists have found much of interest in it. Figures like Jan Assmann and Eric Hornegg. These are, there are a lot of different readings on it, so it's not as preposterous as it may seem, but it's also interesting as theoretical conjecture. As I said previously, Edward Said did a wonderful talk on this that was presented at the Freud House, called Freud and the Non-European, when he's thinking as a Palestinian man responding to Palestinian Arab, responding to Freud's theorization of Moses as an Egyptian. Well, we're still going to be focused on Totem and Taboo, but he returns to many of these same theses that he presents in Totem and Taboo in his book Moses and Monotheism, but he reflects upon them in light of these changed historical conditions. And so we'll look at both texts, and we'll look at his presentation. He has a very nice, concise summary of this theory of the father horde and the brother clan in Moses and monotheism that we'll have a look at as we do a close reading. A lot of what we do will reinforce what we've already done, but in light of these changing historical concerns in the years that have passed since he originally wrote Totem and Taboo, and then how he speculates on the evolution of the Christian religion, out of this, the killing of the father that took place in this proto historic time that he's theorizing about, as the existence of this event linked to the killing of the father, and this transition that humans underwent as they moved from the time of what he calls the father horde to the brother clan, and how the memory of this event, this enormous cultural transition, he speculates, must have somehow stayed with us. And we're going to see him linking this guilt to this question about the killing of the father to the development of the doctrine of original sin. It's interesting, there are references in Moses and monotheism also to what he calls sort of a phylogenetic residue that must have been transmitted genetically. And here is where we find Freud at his most speculative, perhaps not some of his strongest work. It also certainly links his thinking to, figures like, Jung, and it becomes kind of a chemical matter of how, like in the way that Carl Jung theorizes the archetypes of the collective unconscious as having this sort of evolutionary nature. But remember, the doctrine of the archetypes of the collective unconscious in Carl Jung, which, say, someone like Jordan Peterson is so fond of, and many of the followers of Jung, are what, say, Kant would consider to be a dogmatic, in the same way that Chomsky's universal grammar is a kind of a dogmatism, because he's articulating, he's essentially, it's metaphysical speculation that is articulated as dogma. But what Jung's archetypal structures have in common with Chomsky's universal grammar is that they don't, they're simply matters of speculation. So here we find Freud speculating about a kind of a genetic transmission of this memory of the killing of the father that must have become sort of transmitted even as a matter of our very genetic heritage. It's an interesting argument. It's very speculative. It's not particularly, when we get to that part of the reading, it's not as empirical as his reading or as his attempts to theorize the emergence of the brother clan. But it's worth considering, and it's also led many, for instance, Jewish commentators like Emanuel Rice to think of Freud as sort of returning to his a sense of his own Jewish heritage in this last text, or sort of thinking of that heritage. But it's strange that may be the case. Rice's book is interesting, as is other studies of this, but it is strange in the sense that if it is Freud returning to the fold, as some have said, as opposed to being an atheist, and there's a funny story where Freud, I think Freud liked to tell, where he would say, that one of his kids came home from school singing I think this is an apocryphal story. I don't know if there's what the truth is but one of his children came home from school, went to a Christian school and was inculcated in the church doctrine, and came home singing songs about the Trinity. And Freud was reputed to have said something like, "Let's get this straight. There's only one God and we don't believe in him." Well, so Freud was, that sort of sums it up. I mean, he was an atheist, but perhaps here he does become, there is a sort of a more religious sensibility or reflection here that's worth pondering. But in any case, let's look and see what he has to say. Again, we'll look carefully at these passages. Our goal is I'm throwing out speculative notions here. But I'm not interested in proving or disproving this. As merely as making sure that it's clear to us, because it's also very interesting in terms of thinking about deconstructive readings of, say, Carl Schmitt, as Derrida does in the concept of the political, and in specters of Marx as well. When we try to theorize this sort of state of nature, but in doing so in Freudian Darwinian terms, there's a lot of sort of food for thought that comes out of this. So let's just review some of these concepts that will already be familiar to us from the last lecture, and then we'll see what he does with them in Moses and Monotheism. So I've entitled this talk Freud's Totem and Taboo, Father, Horde, Brother, Clan. Okay. So let's read what he has to say in 1939 from Moses and Monotheism, also the year that he died. So he's summarizing his earlier hypothesis here. He does it in a very concise way. From Darwin, I borrowed the hypothesis that men originally lived in small hordes, Each of the horde stood under the rule of an older male who, governed by brute force, appropriated all the females and belabored or killed all the young males, including his own sons. From Atkinson, I received the suggestion that this patriarchal system came to an end through a rebellion of the sons who united against the father, overpowering him and together consuming his body. Okay, so this is, again, the emergence of the democratic, as in, the democratic conspiracy of the sons to rise up against the father and then to kill him and collectively consume his body. Following Robertson Smith's totem theory, I suggested that this horde, previously ruled by the father, was followed by a totemistic brother clan. In order to be able to live in peace with one another, the victorious brothers renounced the women for whose sake they had killed the father and agreed to practice exogamy, which is marrying outside of the clan. The power of the father was broken. This is that marked the end of the era of the father horde, but as we're going to see, he's going to say this left a kind of a legacy of guilt among the sons. And the families regulated by matriarchy. And I think let's note in passing that the guilt would be also linked to the longevity of the way in which this father horde dynamic would have existed for hundreds upon hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. And so it would have marked an enormous cultural transition. The ambivalence of the sons toward the father remained in force during the whole further development. Instead of the father, a certain animal was declared the totem. It stood for their ancestor and protecting spirit, and no one was allowed to hurt or kill it. Once a year, however, the whole clan assembled for a feast at which the otherwise revered totem was torn to pieces and eaten. No one was permitted to abstain from this feast. It was the solemn repetition of the father murder. Okay, this would be akin, even, think of the rite of communion in the Christian tradition, as we'll discuss in a moment. Because, again, as he notes, that you could not abstain from the feast because it was a matter of the guilt being shared collectively. I mean, much like you think of a firing squad where, 10 different men line up with guns, and some of them have blanks and some of them have bullets. So this way they never really know who's the one who killed the condemned man, but it's the guilt is shared collectively, in which social order, moral laws, and religion had their beginnings. The correspondence of the totem feast, according to Robert Smith's description with the Christian communion, has struck many authors before me. Okay, so very, very interesting. Okay, let's continue. Here's how he articulates this dynamic from Totem and Taboo, published much earlier. One day, the expelled brothers joined forces, slew and ate the father, and thus put an end to the father horde, which is going to leave this sense of guilt that will be transmitted phylogenetically. Together they dared and accomplished what would have remained impossible for them singly. Perhaps some advance in culture, like the use of a new weapon, had given them the feeling of superiority. Of course, these cannibalistic savages ate their victim. This violent primal father had surely been the envied and feared model for each of the brothers. Now they had accomplished their identification with him by devouring him, and each acquired a part of his strength, again, by virtue of eating him. The totem feast, which is perhaps mankind's first celebration, would be the repetition and commemoration of this memorable criminal act, with which so many things began: social organization, moral restrictions, and religion. In order to find these results acceptable, quite aside from our supposition, we need only assume that the group of brothers banded together were dominated by the same contradictory feelings toward the father, which we can demonstrate as the content of ambivalence of the father complex in all our children and in neurotics. They hated the father who stood so powerfully in the way of their sexual demands and their desire for power, but they also loved and admired him. After they had satisfied their hate by his removal and had carried out their wish for identification with him, the suppressed tender impulses had to assert themselves. This took place in the form of remorse, A sense of guilt was formed, which coincided here with the remorse generally felt. The dead now became stronger than the living had been, even as we observe it today in the destinies of men. All right, so the dead father becomes, again, even if we put it in metaphysical terms, can become also a kind of a present absent, witness, who's said to be present during the swearing of oaths or vows. This is kind of a third who is omnipresent, but as an absence, a present that is also absence. Hence, this would be a kind of a anthropological speculation on the origin of metaphysics. They undid their deed by declaring that the killing of the father's substitute, the totem, was not allowed, and renounced the fruits of their deed by denying themselves the liberated women. Thus they created, this is again, origin of the incest prohibition. Thus they created the two fundamental taboos of totemism out of the sense of guilt of the son, and for this very reason, these had to correspond with the two repressed wishes of the Oedipus complex. Whoever disobeyed became guilty of the only two crimes which troubled primitive society. Again, the killing of the father and sexual relations with the mother, or in the case of the totemic clan, with the women, with men having sex with the women within the same, who bear the same mark of the same totem. Though the brothers had joined forces in order to overcome the father, each was the other's rival among the women. Each one, here we have emergence of the democratic, each one wanted to have them all to himself like the father, and in the fight of each against the other, the new organization would have perished. For there was no longer any one stronger than all the rest who could have successfully assumed the role of the father. Okay, so let's think here, if we think of in Rousseauian terms in the social contract, that the res publica, the public thing, which is summoned into being or conjured into being through swearing together, Rousseau's going to say will inevitably collapse or implode if all members of the social contract aren't equal with one another. And so this emergent social contract with the brothers is democratic. This shift from, let's say, the tyrannical father horde to the more democratic sharing that emerges between the brothers implies the equality of all within this new res publica that has been brought into being. So thus there was nothing left for the brothers if they wanted to live together but to erect the incest prohibition, perhaps after many difficult experiences, through which they all equally renounced the women whom they desired, those within their own clan, again, hence the origin also of exogamy, and on account of whom they had removed the father in the first place. Thus, they saved the organization which had made them strong and which could be based upon the homosexual feelings and activities which probably manifested themselves among them during the time of their banishment. Okay, so here's a really interesting part of his theory, because he's suggesting that when the weaker males were driven out of the father horde and not allowed to have sex with the women of the horde, they would have had to relieve their sexual desires. They might have, found some female that they would have shared among themselves, perhaps, or they would have homosexual activities in order to relieve their sexual desire. And so this is interesting too, if we think of philosophy and the way that we've conceptualized it in our reading of the erotic in Socrates and in Plato, which is based on this philia, brotherly love, which has an erotic component, but is not acted upon, because what one pursues is wisdom, as opposed to, say, Lysias, who wants to have sex with Phaedrus. We call this sort of friends with benefits argument. This implies, again, remember, for Socrates and for Plato both, there's a kind of an erotic energy that circulates in relationships. And so this would have been, present, and this would have been one of the factors that was present in the brother clan as well. And it would have remained an element in their new assembly or their new organization that they had brought into being. It would have been a residual element of what existed in the time of their banishment during the time of the father horde. Okay, so the claim of totemism, Freud says, to be considered the first attempt at a religion is connected with the other taboo, which protects the life of the totem animal. The feelings of the sons found a natural and appropriate substitute for the father in the animal, but their compulsory treatment of it expressed more than the need of showing remorse. The surrogate for the father was perhaps used as an attempt to assuage the burning sense of guilt, the surrogate being, again, the totemic animal, and to bring about a kind of reconciliation with the father. So if the totem animal is a substitute for the father, and then the animal becomes a stand-in also for the father when it's ritually killed during these rites, it would also be a stand-in for the father when it becomes this kind of guiding spirit that leads the clan, and becomes associated with the totemic, name of the brother clan. The totem religion had issued from the sense of guilt of the sons as an attempt to palliate or to assuage this feeling and to conciliate the injured father through subsequent obedience to him, all right, in the form of the animal who becomes this taboo, who's both, as we said, holy and unclean at the same time, or sacred and unscathed and yet unclean also. All later religions prove for Freud to be attempts to solve the same problem. The religion of totemism included not only manifestations of remorse and attempts at reconciliation, but also serves to commemorate the triumph over the father. Okay, then there's something very interesting to pause on for just a second. Despite, again, remember, it's marked, the feelings of the brothers are marked by ambivalence. So while they have this guilt that Freud's even going to say is phylogenetically transmitted and remains with us today, this agonizing sense of guilt, which is becomes one of the main themes of Kafka, for instance, is also accompanied by a kind of a triumphant sense of triumph, of having defeated the father, the triumph that comes from the vanquishing the father. The social and fraternal feelings on which this great change is based, henceforth for long periods, exercises the greatest influence upon the development of society. They find expression in the sanctification of the common blood and in the emphasis upon the solidarity of life within the clan. And thus ensuring each other's lives, the brothers express the fact that no one of them is to be treated by the other as they all treated the father. They preclude a repetition, of the fate of the father. Okay. Okay, the question as to the relation of animal to human sacrifice can now be easily solved. The original animal sacrifice was already a substitute for a human sacrifice. Okay, we saw this when we discussed the question of the Abrahamic sacrifice, when Abraham sacrificed Isaac in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Ishmael in the Islamic tradition. The animal comes to be a sort of stand-in in what we call this economy of exchange. In this case, for the solemn killing of the father. And when the father's substitute regained its human form, there we have again another metamorphosis. The animal substitute could also be retransformed into a human sacrifice. All right, so we have metamorphosis upon metamorphosis, human to animal, animal to human, back to animal, and so on. Okay, now let's look at what Freud has to say about Christianity. And again, it's not my intention here to offend anyone's beliefs, but this is what Freud has to say. And it's a very interesting theory, And it's worth just kind of, reflecting upon for a moment in light of what we've just read and how it's going to kind of organically come out of his theory of the emergence of the brother clan out of the father horde. He's going to say, in the Christian myth, man's original sin is undoubtedly an offense against God the Father. All right, so this is, remember, in the Pauline Christian tradition, which is characteristic of the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant traditions, which predominate in the West. All the not maybe necessarily as much in the Monophysite traditions of Africa and Egypt, but one of the defining characteristics of Pauline Christianity is its doctrine of sin, of original sin, which is, as we said previously when we discussed Augustine, so deeply a part of who we are that it's present even in babies. Okay, even babies are, as Paul's going to say, all are sinful, all in need of salvation. So the two, like if you wanted to summarize Pauline theology in 4 words: big sin, big salvation. So our sins are very profound. There's no way we can save ourselves. Hence, we need the sacrifice of the Son as a way of remitting our sins. And so, for instance, if you were to say, you don't have, for instance, in the Islamic tradition, a doctrine of original sin, not like in the Christian tradition, because the doctrine of original sin goes hand in hand with the doctrine of Christ's sacrifice on the cross to pay for the sins of humanity. Now, in Islam, Jesus doesn't die on the cross. As the Quran says, a substitute is placed for him. But so, consequently, there's not as much emphasis on this idea of original sin as we find in the Christian tradition. But for Paul, if you're Pauline in your thinking, there's no possible way that one can save oneself. One needs the gift of this sacrifice to pay for one's sin. So big sin, big salvation. This is also Freud saying, he's linking this idea of original sin, which is so prominent in the Christian tradition, to this malaise that we feel, this ongoing guilt that is inexplicable, that seems to be transmitted generation, which he sees as linked to this historic event when this transition occurred between the father horde and the brother clan, and the brothers rose up and killed the father. So the guilt is for the killing of the father. The son is, we're going to see, a sacrifice as a way of paying for this sin. Okay. And again, in the Christian myth, man's original sin is undoubtedly an offense against God the Father. And if Christ redeems mankind from the weight of original sin by sacrificing his own life, he forces us to the conclusion that this sin was indeed murder. According to the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which is deeply rooted in human feeling, a murder can be atoned only by the sacrifice of another life. The self-sacrifice points to a blood guilt. And if this sacrifice of one's own life brings about a reconciliation with God, the Father, then the crime which must be expiated can only have been the murder of the Father. Thus, in the Christian doctrine, mankind most unreservedly acknowledges the guilty deed of primordial times because it has now found the most complete expiation for this deed in the sacrificial death of the Son. The reconciliation with the Father is the more thorough because simultaneously with this sacrifice, there follows the complete renunciation of women for whose sake mankind rebelled against the Father. Now think here, again, which you don't have in Islam, for instance, but only in Christianity, or you don't have it in Judaism either, this idea of vows of chastity, which would be linked to the complete renunciation of women. And we were thinking about this in terms of what we call the orgiastic secret, this unproblematized ambivalence in the Christian tradition to the erotic. But now also the psychological fatality of ambivalence demands its rights. In the same deed which offers the greatest possible expiation to the Father, the Son also attains the goal of his wishes against the Father. He becomes a God himself besides, or rather in place of his Father. The religion of the Son succeeds the religion of the Father. As a sign of this substitution, the old totem feast is revived again in the form of communion, in which the band of brothers now eats the flesh and blood of the Son and no longer that of the Father, the sons thereby identifying themselves with him and becoming holy themselves. Thus, through the ages, we see the identity of the totem feast with the animal sacrifice, the anthropomorphic human sacrifice, and the Christian Eucharist. And on all these solemn occasions, we recognize the after effects of that crime which so oppressed men, but of which they must have been so proud. At bottom, however, and here's sort of the key point, the Christian communion is a new setting aside of the Father, or a new kind of killing of the Father, a repetition of the crime that must be expiated. All right, this is Susan Handelman has a wonderful book called The Slayers of Moses. So we can think of this also is a sense of a kind of a new slaying of the Father. And Handelman sees in Freud a kind of a slaying, as a killing of Moses in his theory of Moses. We see how well justified is Fraser's dictum that the Christian communion has absorbed within itself a sacrifice which is doubtless far older than Christianity. And he's speaking of Sir James Fraser, The Golden Bough, which is a classic of anthropology, very much worth a look. But so the point here is that it has its origins in something much, much older than Christianity. This sort of symbolic cannibalism, the eating of the bread, which is the flesh, drinking of the wine, which is the blood of Christ. We see it has this anthropomorphic origins in Fraser's theorization of it. A process like the removal of the primal father by the band of brothers must have left, and here we get the phylogenetic speculation, much have left ineradicable traces in the history of mankind, and must have expressed itself the more frequently in numerous substitutive formations, the less it itself was to be remembered. Okay, so there's the key passage here is these traces that are left that can't be eradicated, that they're still with us even today, no matter how modern we are. And you think of like Kafka and this, when you read like The Trial, wonderful novel, and just the way in which Kafka in text after text is just riveted by a sense of guilt. Well, where this is what Freud is asking himself. Well, where does this come from? And so the guilt is not just for Freud. It's not just a Christian phenomenon, but in Christian theology, there's a way of addressing this problem or this guilt, which is even transmitted to us in our very through our very genetic makeup for Freud. So he's going to say, it is not easy, this is from Moses and monotheism, it is not easy to translate the concepts of individual psychology into mass psychology. And I do not think that much is to be gained by introducing the concept of a collective unconscious. The content of the unconscious is collective anyhow. This is a really interesting aside here. Again, remember, this is one of his last books. This is after Freud and Jung have already had their falling out. And he's essentially saying, Jung's theory of the collective unconscious is not necessary. That's already implied in the theory that I already developed. His theory is essentially derivative, but it's not. It's also, he's not saying. He's not saying the same thing as Jung, because the archetypes of the collective unconscious are kind of like Kantian a prioris or innate ideas that for Jung are these speculative evolutionary structures that become constellated in particular ways based on our empirical experience. This is this idea. Jung is influenced by Kant as well in terms of the a priori, which is the knowledge that we have prior to empirical experiences can only for Kant it can only be activated on the occasion of experience, and the same is true for Jung. But the difference is that for Kant, if you are any articulation of a priori's in dogmatic language would already, it would already be a kind of a dogmatism because it would assume an empirical form. And so I think, from a Kantian reading of Jung, then the archetypes of the collective unconscious would be like the universal grammar of Chomsky would be a kind of a dogmatic metaphysics that Kant was seeking very diligently to evade. All right, let's continue. We must conclude that the mental residue of these primeval times has become a heritage which, with each new generation, needs only to be awakened, not to be reacquired. Okay, that there we go. That's really interesting. This is Freud. I don't want to say he's senile here, but this is Freud at the end of his life. This is, Edward Said likes to talk about what he calls late style. He kind of the older theorist, philosopher, thinker who doesn't really care what anybody thinks anymore, and sort of lets the guard down and is not as careful in his articulation of some of these things. Kind of a cranky approach to theory and philosophy. We learned that our children in a number of significant relationships do not react as their own experiences would lead us to expect, but instinctively like animals. This is explicable only by phylogenetic inheritance. Well, that sounds a lot like a disappointed father. I raised my kids to be a certain way, and no matter what I did, they still are manifesting tendencies that could have only been, passed down genetically. They couldn't have been. They didn't learn it from me. So there's of course there's truth to this. This is this nature nurture argument that we all are left with wondering about from time to time. Okay, so this will conclude this particular lecture, and this is a again, there's some new material here, but it's not so much new as it is, a rehashing of what we already heard, but also rethinking in light of the Christian tradition as well, and rethought in Freud's later years. And we want to note too that he's going to identify the Apostle Paul as being the main figure who is, responsible for identifying or for linking this malaise about the killing of the father and giving it the name of original sin. And so he credits Paul with that. It's interesting theory. In any case, I hope that you'll find this material to be useful to you, and I would urge you to do further reading in Freud. This is only one aspect of his thought, but it's a particularly interesting one for those interested in proper naming, the totem and animal metamorphosis.